Life can change in an instant. One moment, you're walking through your routine, carrying the weight of your ambitions and dreams. The next, you're thrust into a whirlwind of accusations, judgment, and public scrutiny. Today, we delve into the story of Emmanuel Pedram, a dignified man in a suit whose life took a shocking turn when he became the face of systemic injustice. Emmanuel's story is not just about him. It's about the fight for fairness, compassion, and the courage to stand tall in the face of adversity. Imagine this: a man, polished and professional, goes about his day only to be wrongfully accused, humiliated, and arrested for no apparent reason. What follows is a gripping tale of resilience, outrage, and a rallying cry for justice that resonates far beyond one individual. By the end of this journey, you'll not only feel inspired, but empowered to challenge the wrongs in your world. Before we dive into this compelling story, take a moment to connect with this journey. If you've ever stood for fairness or wished for a kinder, more just society, type this affirmation in the comments. I believe in justice and equality for all. Subscribe to this channel for more thought-provoking stories, and let's walk this road together. Now let's begin where all great stories do, with the day everything changed. It was a crisp autumn morning in the heart of the city. Emmanuel Pedram, a black man in his late 30s, exuded confidence and calm as he strolled down a bustling street. His tailored navy suit, polished Oxford shoes, and leather briefcase reflected a man of purpose and dignity. Emmanuel was an attorney with a mission, advocating for civil rights and equality. Little did he know, this day would put everything he believed in to the ultimate test. As he approached a corner coffee shop to grab his usual morning latte, his eyes scanned the crowd with quiet curiosity. The air was alive with the sound of footsteps, conversations, and the occasional honk of a car horn. Then, without warning, the peaceful rhythm of the morning shattered. "Sir, stop right there." The voice was sharp, commanding, and filled with suspicion. Emmanuel turned to see two police officers approaching him, their faces stern and their postures rigid. Officers Rian and Philip had been patrolling the area when they received a vague report about a suspicious individual matching Emmanuel's description. The problem? The description was no more specific than a black man in a suit. Caught off guard but composed, Emmanuel stood still as the officers confronted him. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. "You match the description of someone involved in suspicious activity nearby," Officer Philip replied, his hand resting on his belt. The insinuation was clear, and Emmanuel's heart sank. He knew this script too well, one all too familiar to countless individuals like him. "What exactly am I being accused of?" Emmanuel inquired, his tone polite yet firm. But instead of answers, he was met with increasing hostility. The officers demanded to search his belongings, citing reasonable suspicion. The crowd around them began to take notice. Phones emerged from pockets, and cameras started recording. Passers-by whispered among themselves, some expressing concern, others simply watching the spectacle unfold. Emmanuel, aware of the growing audience, remained calm and cooperative, knowing that any show of resistance could escalate the situation further. The officers' search turned up nothing. No weapons, no stolen property, nothing to justify their suspicions. Yet instead of admitting their error, they doubled down. "We need you to come with us for further questioning," Officer Rian said, gripping Emmanuel's arm. "Am I under arrest?" Emmanuel asked, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "You're being detained," Rian replied curtly, ignoring the subtle distinction between lawful arrest and arbitrary detainment. Emmanuel's chest tightened. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, another man of color, being criminalized without cause. The officers began to handcuff Emmanuel. His briefcase fell to the ground, its contents scattering a notebook filled with meticulous legal notes, a copy of the Constitution, and a framed photo of his late father. The crowd gasped. The image of this well-dressed, composed man being humiliated seared into their minds. For Emmanuel, the indignity was not just personal. It was a reminder of the systemic failures he had dedicated his life to fighting. He thought of his clients, marginalized individuals who had faced similar injustices. Now he was living their reality. As the officers led Emmanuel toward their patrol car, he heard murmurs of discontent growing among the onlookers. "This isn't right," one voice said. Another chimed in. "He didn't do anything." Some shouted at the officers, demanding an explanation. But it was the silent act of recording, dozens of phones capturing every moment, that would change everything. Emmanuel maintained his composure, even as the world seemed to tilt on its axis. He knew he was being wronged, but he also knew the power of restraint. The irony wasn't lost on him. An attorney who had spent years advocating for justice now found himself at the mercy of the very system he sought to reform. By the time the patrol car drove away, the crowd was abuzz with outrage. Within minutes, videos of the arrest began appearing on social media, accompanied by captions like "wrongfully arrested" and "racial profiling in broad daylight." The incident was no longer just a local altercation. It was about to become a national story. For Emmanuel, the drive to the police station was a blur of emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. But amid the turmoil, a spark of resolve ignited within him. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, and dehumanized. Emmanuel vowed that, if he ever got the chance, he would turn this injustice into a beacon of change. As the patrol car pulled into the station, Emmanuel took a deep breath and steadied himself. This was only the beginning of a journey he never anticipated, but was now determined to see through. The scene may have ended, but the story was just beginning. As videos of Emmanuel's arrest spread like wildfire online, they ignited a firestorm of outrage that would shake the nation to its core. What happened next would transform Emmanuel from a victim into a symbol of resilience and hope. But how did a simple video clip turn into a movement for justice? And what shocking revelations would come to light? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. As Emmanuel Pedram sat in the dimly lit holding cell of the police station, unaware of what awaited him outside, his story had already begun to sweep across the digital landscape. Social media, with its unparalleled ability to amplify voices, had transformed a quiet injustice into a deafening outcry. The videos of Emmanuel's wrongful arrest, recorded by concerned bystanders, spread with remarkable speed. In each clip, viewers saw the same distressing scene: a poised, impeccably dressed black man being restrained and humiliated without cause, his composure unbroken even under the weight of prejudice. The first posts were simple, direct, and outraged. A caption read, "This man did nothing wrong. Why is he being treated this way?" accompanied by a shaky but telling video. Then came the hashtags: #Justice for Emmanuel, #Stop Racial Profiling, and #Accountability Now. Within hours, these phrases were trending across platforms. The footage struck a collective nerve. People across the world, from activists to everyday users, began to share the videos, calling for answers and action. The power of social media lies in its ability to humanize injustice, and Emmanuel's arrest became a vivid symbol of systemic failure. Observers picked apart every frame of the recordings: the dismissive tone of the officers, the unnecessary force used, the scattered contents of Emmanuel's briefcase, lying in stark contrast to the ground. The sight of his framed family photo, a testament to his humanity, evoked particular outrage. One commenter wrote, "This could be my father, my brother, my friend. No one deserves this." The sentiment was echoed in hundreds of thousands of posts, each one amplifying the growing demand for justice. News outlets quickly picked up the story. National headlines framed Emmanuel as a man wrongfully accused, a victim of implicit bias and overreach. Morning shows and roundtable discussions explored the broader implications of his case. Pundits debated the fine line between public safety and abuse of power, while others honed in on the racial undertones of the incident. Clips of Emmanuel's arrest were played repeatedly on television, forcing viewers to confront the unsettling reality. A man's dignity had been stripped away for no other reason than an officer's misplaced suspicion. Civil rights organizations, always vigilant for moments like this, seized the opportunity to highlight the systemic nature of such injustices. Influential groups like the National Equality Foundation and the Urban Justice Alliance issued statements condemning the arrest and calling for accountability. Their leaders appeared on major networks, drawing connections between Emmanuel's story and the countless others who had faced similar fates without the benefit of public scrutiny. Among the social media posts that went viral, one particularly resonated. A young black lawyer shared a powerful statement alongside the video. Emmanuel Pedram is not just a victim, he's a reflection of what so many of us face every day. He was wrongfully arrested, but how many others go unseen? Unheard? This is why we fight. The post garnered millions of likes and shares, sparking heartfelt discussions in the comments section. As the story gained traction, celebrities and public figures began to lend their voices to the cause. Actors, athletes, and activists took to their platforms, amplifying the demand for justice. One influential singer tweeted, "I don't know Emmanuel, but I see myself in him. Calm, composed, but still treated as a threat. This has to stop." Others posted links to organizations advocating for police reform, urging their followers to donate or get involved. The debate extended beyond social media and into communities and households. Conversations about Emmanuel's case became unavoidable, whether at dinner tables, workplaces, or classrooms. People questioned the biases embedded within the justice system and reflected on their own assumptions. For many, Emmanuel's story was a tipping point, a moment that crystallized the need for systemic change. Of course, not all reactions were sympathetic. Some argued that the officers were simply doing their job, that Emmanuel's composure might have masked guilt, or that the public outrage was overblown. These dissenting voices, while present, were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming consensus. Emmanuel had been wronged, and the system enabling such misconduct needed to be held accountable. Amid the growing storm, Emmanuel remained unaware of the world rallying behind him. As he sat in his cell, his thoughts oscillated between anger and resolve. What had happened to him wasn't just personal, it was a symptom of a broader disease, one that he had spent his career fighting against. He knew that his arrest would leave a mark, but he couldn't yet foresee the scope of the movement it would ignite. Meanwhile, on the outside, the demand for justice grew louder. The hashtags gained momentum, reaching millions within hours. Community leaders organized peaceful rallies, using Emmanuel's case as a focal point for broader calls for reform. Local activists urged city officials to respond, while national organizations pressured lawmakers to enact meaningful change. In a matter of days, Emmanuel's name had become synonymous with resilience, dignity, and the unyielding demand for fairness. The firestorm reached its peak when a prominent journalist conducted an investigative piece on the officers involved. Their histories revealed troubling patterns, complaints of misconduct, accusations of excessive force, and unresolved investigations. The revelations only added fuel to the outrage, painting a picture of a broken system that allowed unchecked power to persist. The attention became too significant for city officials to ignore. The mayor issued a statement promising a thorough investigation, while the police department announced that the officers had been placed on administrative leave pending review. For the public, these gestures felt insufficient. The question loomed, would this lead to real change, or would it become another forgotten headline? Through it all, one thing became clear. Emmanuel's story had transcended his personal ordeal. It had become a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had experienced injustice and for those determined to create a better world. The conversation sparked by his case continued to grow, connecting people across divides and planting seeds of hope and action. As the world united in outrage over Emmanuel's arrest, the pressure on authorities to deliver justice intensified. But just as the public's faith in the system began to waver, a stunning revelation would shift the narrative once again. Who was Emmanuel Pedram really? And how would this new information change everything? Stay with us to uncover the shocking truth about the man behind the suit. The public's outrage over Emmanuel Pedram's arrest reached a fever pitch. But just as the cries for justice began to solidify into organized demands, a startling new layer to the story emerged. Social media had already crowned Emmanuel a symbol of dignity and resilience, but no one knew the full extent of his identity. That was about to change, and when it did, the revelation would elevate his case from a moment of injustice to a monumental turning point in the fight for equality. As Emmanuel sat silently in the interrogation room, the officers who had arrested him began the routine process of running his identification through their database. Officer Philip, still confident that their actions were justified, assumed they'd find something, a warrant, a prior charge, anything that might validate their treatment of Emmanuel. Instead, what appeared on the screen left both officers stunned. Emmanuel Pedram was no ordinary citizen. He wasn't just a polished professional with an impeccable suit and a calm demeanor. He was a renowned civil rights attorney with a distinguished career advocating for marginalized communities. Not only had he built a reputation for taking on high-profile cases of racial injustice, but he was also a sought-after speaker, educator, and advisor to policymakers on issues of systemic inequality. The realization hit the officers like a thunderbolt. They had not just wrongfully arrested an innocent man, they had detained one of the most influential figures in the fight against the very injustices they had just perpetuated. For a moment, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Then, the officers exchanged glances that betrayed a flicker of panic. They knew this was no ordinary mistake. This was a potential catastrophe. Meanwhile, outside the station, Emmanuel's identity was already being uncovered by journalists and social media users. Within hours, news outlets were reporting this stunning truth. Headlines blared, "Wrongfully arrested man revealed as civil rights icon," and "Advocate for justice becomes victim of systemic bias." The revelation ignited a second wave of public outcry, this one even more intense than the first. The discovery that Emmanuel was a civil rights attorney added a bitter irony to the narrative. Commentators pointed out the systemic absurdity. If a man with Emmanuel's credentials, composure, and public standing could be treated this way, what chance did ordinary citizens stand? The story became a glaring indictment of the flaws in the justice system, shining a harsh spotlight on the unchecked biases that had allowed this to happen. As more details about Emmanuel's life and career came to light, the public's admiration for him only grew. His journey was nothing short of inspiring. Born to immigrant parents, Emmanuel had faced his share of struggles growing up. His father, a factory worker, had instilled in him a profound respect for hard work and justice, while his mother, a teacher, had nurtured his love for learning. Together, they had taught Emmanuel the value of standing up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. Emmanuel had graduated at the top of his class from a prestigious law school, where he had already begun to champion the causes of the underserved. Over the years, he had represented countless individuals in cases that challenged discriminatory practices and sought to reform oppressive systems. His work had earned him accolades and respect, but he remained humble, always redirecting praise toward the communities he served. Now, the very system he had dedicated his life to improving had turned against him in the most humiliating way possible. Yet, even as the weight of public outrage threatened to overwhelm the police department, Emmanuel maintained his characteristic grace. In the hours after his release from custody, he issued a calm but powerful statement. "This incident is not just about me. It is about the countless individuals who have faced similar injustices without the privilege of public scrutiny. I stand with them, and I remain committed to creating a world where no one has to endure what I experience today." The statement, posted on social media, quickly went viral. It struck a chord with millions, not only for its eloquence, but for its unyielding focus on the broader issues at hand. Emmanuel's refusal to let his personal ordeal overshadow the systemic problems resonated deeply, inspiring others to channel their anger into action. The revelation of Emmanuel's identity also placed immense pressure on the police department. Major Parker, the head of the department, found himself at the center of a growing storm. Known for his no-nonsense approach, Parker understood the gravity of the situation. In a tense press conference, He promised a full investigation into the officer's actions and emphasized the department's commitment to accountability. But the public wasn't satisfied with promises alone. Demands for tangible change grew louder. Protesters gathered outside the station, holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "End racial profiling now." Leaders from various communities joined forces, calling for policy reforms and increased oversight of law enforcement practices. The pressure was relentless, and the police department faced an uphill battle to regain public trust. For Emmanuel, the revelation of his identity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it amplified his voice and gave him a platform to push for systemic change. On the other hand, it placed an enormous burden on him to navigate the delicate balance between seeking justice for himself and advocating for broader reform. In the days that followed, Emmanuel turned his ordeal into an opportunity to educate and inspire. He appeared on national news programs, spoke at rallies, and penned op-eds that highlighted the urgent need for accountability and empathy within law enforcement. His calm, measured demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos of the situation, earning him widespread respect and admiration. Through it all, Emmanuel remained steadfast in his message. This was not just about one man's experience. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, or forgotten. He urged the public to keep the focus on systemic change rather than individual blame, emphasizing the importance of building a society rooted in compassion and fairness. The revelation of Emmanuel's identity had transformed his story into a movement. What began as an act of injustice had become a rallying cry for equality, a call to action that resonated across divides. Emmanuel's grace under pressure, combined with his unwavering commitment to justice, inspired millions to believe in the possibility of a better world. Just as Emmanuel's story reached new heights, it placed an unrelenting spotlight on the police department and its leaders. Major Parker now faced the challenge of navigating an unprecedented crisis, with the eyes of the nation watching his every move. Would he rise to the occasion and implement meaningful reforms? Or would this be another instance of promises unfulfilled? The community was ready to rise, and so was Emmanuel. The question was, how far would this movement go? Stay tuned as the fight for accountability takes center stage. The revelation of Emmanuel Pedram's identity sent shockwaves through the city's police department. The institution, already under scrutiny for its questionable practices, now found itself at the epicenter of a nationwide debate. The two officers involved in the incident, Rian and Philip, had unwittingly escalated a localized act of prejudice into a full-blown crisis of credibility. For Major Parker, the head of the department, the stakes couldn't have been higher. His leadership and the integrity of the force he commanded were on trial in the court of public opinion. Major Parker was a man of contrasts, a seasoned law enforcement officer with a reputation for toughness. He was also known for his pragmatism and ability to read the mood of the public. Over his 3-decade career, he had navigated numerous challenges, but nothing could have prepared him for the storm that followed Emmanuel's arrest. The streets outside the police department were filled with protesters holding signs that read, "Justice for Emmanuel" and "Reform Now." News vans lined the curbs, and journalists bombarded the department with questions about accountability and systemic racism. Inside the department, tension was palpable. Officers whispered among themselves, divided over the handling of the situation. Some expressed frustration, arguing that the department was being unfairly targeted. Others acknowledged that the arrest was indefensible and worried about the long-term implications for their profession. Meanwhile, Parker was holed up in his office, poring over reports and fielding calls from city officials demanding immediate action. The first task on Parker's agenda was damage control. At a hastily arranged press conference, he stood before the cameras, his expression a mixture of resolve and weariness. "The events surrounding Mr. Pedram's arrest are deeply troubling," he began. "Let me be clear. We are conducting a thorough investigation, and we are committed to transparency and accountability. Our community deserves nothing less." While his words were carefully chosen, they did little to quell the growing outrage. For many, The statement felt like just another hollow promise. Critics pointed out that similar assurances had been made in the past, yet meaningful change remained elusive. Behind the scenes, Parker was acutely aware of the precariousness of his position. His ability to regain public trust hinged on how he handled the fallout. He convened a meeting with senior officers, legal advisors, and public relations experts to develop a strategy. The consensus was clear. The department needed to demonstrate a genuine commitment to reform, and it needed to do so quickly. The first step was addressing the actions of Officers Rian and Phillip. Both men were placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of an internal investigation. For some members of the public, this was a small victory, but it was far from enough. Activists and community leaders demanded more. Public apologies, firings, and even criminal charges. To complicate matters, additional reports began to surface about prior complaints against the two officers. These allegations painted a damning picture of a culture that tolerated misconduct. Journalists unearthed records of excessive force complaints, racial bias allegations, and unresolved disciplinary cases. The revelations fueled the firestorm, making it clear that the problem extended beyond two individuals. It was systemic. Amid this chaos, Parker faced another challenge: maintaining morale within the department. Many officers felt demoralized, perceiving the public outrage as an attack on their profession as a whole. Some argued that they were being unfairly vilified, while others quietly admitted that the department needed to take a hard look at itself. Parker held closed-door meetings with his team, urging them to remain professional and empathetic. "We're here to serve the community," he reminded them. "That means we need to listen, learn, and do better." While Parker struggled to manage internal dynamics, the public's demands grew louder. Grassroots organizations organized town hall meetings, inviting community members to share their experiences with law enforcement. Stories of racial profiling, excessive force, and lack of accountability poured in, each one adding weight to the calls for reform. One such meeting was particularly poignant. A young woman stood up and recounted her own experience of being wrongfully detained as a teenager. Her voice trembled as she described the fear and humiliation she felt, and the long-lasting impact it had on her sense of safety. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face, and the room fell silent. "This isn't just about one man," she said, her voice breaking. "This is about all of us who have been treated like we don't matter." The emotional weight of these stories was undeniable, and they began to shift the conversation from outrage to action. Emmanuel, though still recovering from his ordeal, played a pivotal role in this shift. He attended several of these town halls, listening intently to the stories and offering words of encouragement. His presence lent credibility to the movement and reinforced its message of unity and resilience. In one memorable address, Emmanuel spoke directly to the audience, his voice steady and heartfelt. "Change doesn't come from anger alone," he said. "It comes from channeling that anger into action. We have an opportunity to build something better, a system that protects and respects every individual, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Parker couldn't ignore the momentum building around Emmanuel and the broader movement for reform. He reached out to Emmanuel, requesting a private meeting to discuss potential solutions. The meeting, held in a neutral location to avoid public scrutiny, was a turning point. For hours, the two men engaged in a candid dialogue about the challenges facing law enforcement and the steps needed to rebuild trust. Though they came from different worlds, Parker and Emmanuel found common ground in their shared desire for accountability and fairness. Emmanuel presented a series of policy recommendations, including mandatory bias training, the establishment of an independent oversight board, and the implementation of body cameras for all officers. Parker, while cautious about the logistics, recognized the value of these proposals and pledged to bring them before city officials. The meeting marked the beginning of a tentative partnership between Emmanuel and the department. While trust would take time to build, their collaboration signaled a willingness to move beyond rhetoric and toward meaningful change. As the police department grappled with its identity and role in the community, the public's call for justice only grew louder. Meanwhile, Emmanuel's resilience and leadership continued to inspire people across the nation. But the true test was yet to come. Could a divided community find a way to heal and unite? And would the changes sparked by Emmanuel's ordeal be enough to dismantle the deeper systemic issues at play? The answers lay in the hands of a rising movement, ready to shape the future. Stay tuned for the next chapter in this transformative journey. The arrest of Emmanuel Pedram had lit a spark, but the revelation of his identity and the broader injustices it symbolized fanned that spark into a blaze of collective action. Across neighborhoods, cities, and eventually the entire nation, communities began to rally together. What had started as an outcry over one man's wrongful arrest evolved into a united demand for systemic change. It began with whispers in coffee shops, heated conversations in homes, and passionate debates in town squares. People felt the weight of Emmanuel's story pressing on their own experiences. For some, it was personal, a reminder of indignities they or their loved ones had endured. For others, it was an awakening, a stark realization that the systems they trusted could be so profoundly flawed. These emotions coalesced into a growing desire to act. The first gatherings were intimate, almost grassroots in nature. Local leaders and activists invited neighbors to meetings in community centers and churches. They shared Emmanuel's story, but more importantly, they encouraged attendees to share their own. One by one, people stood to speak. A father recounted the time he was stopped and frisked in front of his children. A teacher shared how her students, particularly those of color, grew up fearful of those meant to protect them. Tears were shed, voices cracked, and bonds were forged in the shared acknowledgement of pain and the collective yearning for change. Soon, these small gatherings grew into larger movements. Social media played an instrumental role in this transformation. The hashtags #Justice for Emmanuel and #Reform now gained unprecedented traction, evolving into symbols of solidarity and action. Posts that started as expressions of outrage became calls to action. Activists circulated petitions demanding accountability for the officers involved and sweeping changes to police practices. Local influencers and community leaders encouraged participation in marches, rallies, and town hall meetings. The first major march was held just days after Emmanuel's release. Thousands of people from all walks of life flooded the city streets. The diversity of the crowd was striking, young and old, black and white, affluent and working class, all marching under the same banners of justice and equality. They chanted Emmanuel's name, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience and the fight for dignity. Signs carried messages that were both poignant and powerful. This stops now, humanity first, and protect, don't oppress. Emmanuel, though still processing his ordeal, made a surprise appearance at the march. Standing atop a makeshift stage, his voice carried over the crowd. "This isn't just about me," he said, his tone resolute. "This is about all of us. It's about creating a world where no one has to endure the pain of being judged, mistreated, or dehumanized. We have the power to make that world a reality." His words electrified the crowd, drawing thunderous applause and reaffirming their commitment to the cause. Peaceful protests spread across the nation like wildfire. In cities hundreds of miles away, people organized their own demonstrations, drawing inspiration from Emmanuel's story. Each protest brought unique voices and perspectives to the movement, but the message remained consistent. Justice, accountability, and reform were non-negotiable. The marches and rallies were just one aspect of the rising movement. Community leaders also focused on education and dialogue, creating spaces for open conversations about inequality, policing, and systemic bias. These discussions were often difficult, as they forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, prejudice, and the deep-seated issues within their communities. Yet, they were also transformative, fostering understanding and a shared commitment to finding solutions. At the heart of this movement was an unwavering sense of hope. While Emmanuel's ordeal had revealed the depth of the problem, it had also shown the strength of the human spirit and the power of collective action. People began to believe that change was possible, not just in the abstract, but in tangible, actionable ways. One particularly powerful moment came during a town hall meeting organized by local activists. A teenager stood up and spoke about how Emmanuel's story had inspired her to confront her own fears of speaking out. "I used to think my voice didn't matter," she said, her voice trembling. "But if Emmanuel can stand up to all of this, then I can stand up too." Her words brought the room to its feet, a reminder of how one person's courage can inspire countless others. As the movement grew, so too did its impact. City councils began to meet with activists, discussing potential reforms to law enforcement practices. Schools introduced programs on empathy and bias to educate the next generation. Churches, synagogues, and mosques held interfaith services focused on unity and understanding. The momentum was undeniable, and it was driven by people who refused to let the moment pass without making a difference. Emmanuel continued to play a central role in the movement, not as a figurehead but as a partner and advocate. He worked tirelessly with activists, policymakers, and community leaders, sharing his legal expertise and personal insights. At each rally and meeting, he reminded people that their voices and actions were the true engines of change. The movement also attracted national attention, with celebrities, politicians, and thought leaders lending their support. Donations poured in to support grassroots organizations, legal defense funds, and initiatives aimed at addressing systemic inequality. The combined efforts of individuals and institutions began to create a ripple effect, challenging outdated norms and pushing for reforms that once seemed impossible. But progress was not without resistance. There were those who sought to discredit the movement, arguing that it was divisive or that the calls for reform went too far. These criticisms, however, only strengthened the resolve of those involved. Emmanuel himself addressed the backlash in a televised interview. "Change is never easy," he said. "It challenges us to confront what's wrong and imagine what's right. But discomfort is a small price to pay for a world that is fairer, kinder, and just." The community's rise marked a turning point in the fight for justice, but the journey was far from over. As the movement gained traction, Emmanuel's role became even more pivotal. How would he leverage his newfound platform to drive systemic reform? And what challenges would he face as he worked to turn passion into lasting change? The answers lay in the next chapter, where the fight for justice would meet the power of resilience and the hope of a brighter future. Stay tuned. With the groundswell of public support and the momentum of a growing movement behind him, Emmanuel Pedram stepped into a role he had never anticipated, but was uniquely equipped to handle. Having spent his career as a civil rights attorney advocating for those without a voice, Emmanuel now found himself at the forefront of a nationwide battle for justice and accountability. His ordeal had thrust him into the spotlight, and he was determined to use this platform to create meaningful change. Emmanuel's first step was to anchor the movement in action. While rallies and protests galvanized the public, he knew that lasting reform required structure and strategy. Drawing on his legal expertise, he began drafting a comprehensive set of proposals aimed at addressing the systemic issues that had led to his wrongful arrest. These proposals, dubbed the Pedram Principles, focused on three core areas: accountability, transparency, and community engagement. Under the banner of accountability, Emmanuel proposed independent oversight boards to review complaints against law enforcement. These boards would consist of diverse members from the community, ensuring that investigations into police misconduct were impartial and free from internal bias. Transparency measures included the mandatory use of body cameras for all officers and the public release of footage in cases of alleged misconduct. Community engagement focused on bridging the gap between officers and the people they served, advocating for programs that encourage dialogue and mutual understanding. The proposals were bold, but Emmanuel knew they were necessary. "We can't just react to injustice," he said during a televised address. "We need to build systems that prevent it from happening in the first place." His words resonated deeply, earning praise from activists and policymakers alike. Emmanuel's legal acumen also proved invaluable in addressing the specific circumstances of his case. He filed a lawsuit against the city, not out of personal spite, but to shine a light on the systemic failures that had led to his arrest. The lawsuit demanded not only compensation, but also the implementation of reforms within the police department. In interviews, Emmanuel made it clear that his goal was not retribution, but transformation. "This isn't about punishing individuals," he explained. "It's about fixing a broken system so that no one else has to endure what I did." The lawsuit drew significant attention, and its implications extended far beyond Emmanuel's case. Legal experts weighed in, calling it a potential landmark in the fight for police accountability. Activists rallied behind it, using it as a rallying cry to demand broader changes. Meanwhile, Emmanuel remained steadfast, balancing the legal battle with his ongoing advocacy work. As Emmanuel's role in the movement grew, so did his influence. He became a sought-after speaker at events and conferences, where he shared his story and called on others to take action. His speeches, always delivered with a calm but commanding presence, left audiences inspired and motivated. "We all have a part to play in this fight," he often said. "Justice isn't something we wait for, it's something we build together." One of Emmanuel's most impactful initiatives was the creation of the Justice Fellowship Program, a mentorship and advocacy network for young activists and aspiring lawyers. The program provided training, resources, and support to individuals committed to advancing equality and reform. Through workshops, seminars, and one-on-one mentorship, the fellowship equipped participants with the tools they needed to drive change in their communities. The program's launch was met with overwhelming enthusiasm. Thousands of applicants from across the country expressed interest, eager to learn from Emmanuel and contribute to the movement. For Emmanuel, the fellowship represented a way to amplify his impact and ensure that the fight for justice would continue long after his own efforts. Despite his growing influence, Emmanuel remained grounded. He often spoke of the people who had inspired him, his late father, who had taught him the value of integrity, his mother, whose compassion shaped his worldview, and the countless clients he had represented over the years, each one a reminder of why the fight for justice mattered. Emmanuel's humility and authenticity endeared him to the public, but they also made him a target for critics. Some accused him of seeking the spotlight or using his ordeal for personal gain. Others dismissed his proposals as unrealistic or overly ambitious. Emmanuel faced these attacks with the same composure he had shown during his arrest. "Criticism is part of the process," he said in an interview. "What matters is staying focused on the goal." That goal remained clear: to transform the outrage over his arrest into meaningful, lasting reform. Emmanuel knew this would be a long and challenging journey, but he was committed to seeing it through. He often reminded his supporters that change was not a sprint, but a marathon, requiring persistence, patience, and collective effort. The impact of Emmanuel's work soon began to manifest. Several cities adopted elements of the PEDRAM principles, implementing independent oversight boards and increasing transparency in law enforcement practices. The Justice Fellowship Program produced its first cohort of graduates, many of whom went on to lead advocacy efforts in their own communities. And perhaps most importantly, conversations about equality, accountability, and empathy continued to grow, reaching new audiences and inspiring action. Emmanuel's ability to balance advocacy, legal action, and public engagement made him a powerful force in the movement. Yet he remained acutely aware of the challenges ahead. "This is just the beginning," he often said. "The fight for justice is ongoing, and it requires all of us to stay engaged." As Emmanuel's efforts gained momentum, they set the stage for a pivotal moment in the movement. With the nation watching, he prepared to deliver a powerful address that would challenge the system's leaders and call for transformative change. But would his words be enough to sway those in power? And how would the movement respond to the inevitable pushback? The stakes were higher than ever, and the next chapter promised to be the most emotional and decisive yet. Stay tuned. The auditorium was packed to capacity. Rows of chairs stretched endlessly, filled with people of all ages, races, and backgrounds. The energy in the room was electric, a mixture of hope, determination, and the quiet anticipation of a historic moment. On stage stood Emmanuel PEDRAM, poised yet resolute, ready to address not just the crowd before him, but an audience of millions watching the live broadcast. This was the moment Emmanuel had been working toward, a chance to channel the momentum of the movement into a message so powerful it could not be ignored. His speech was not just an appeal for justice, but a demand for accountability, a call to action, and a beacon of hope for a better future. As Emmanuel stepped forward, the room fell silent. He paused for a moment, scanning the faces of the audience, his presence commanding but unpretentious. Then, with a voice steady and clear, he began, "Good evening. Tonight, I speak not just as a man who has experienced injustice, but as a voice for all who have been silenced, ignored, or dismissed by a system that was meant to serve and protect them. My story is not unique, and that is what makes it so profoundly troubling. It is one of countless others, each a testament to the urgent need for change." The room was still, the weight of his words settling like a blanket over the audience. Emmanuel's tone was calm but firm, his measured cadence drawing listeners into the depth of his message. "This is not about blame," he continued. "It is about responsibility. Responsibility to confront the flaws in our systems, to acknowledge the pain they have caused, and to commit ourselves to building something better. We cannot undo the past, but we can shape the future, and that future must be one where justice is not a privilege, but a right." The audience erupted into applause, a thunderous affirmation of his words. Emmanuel raised his hand, not to silence them, but to signal that he had more to say. He recounted the moments of his arrest, not with bitterness, but with the clarity of someone who had turned pain into purpose. He described the confusion, the humiliation, and the anger he felt, but also the resolve that had grown within him. "When I sat in that cell," he said, "I made a promise. I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I would use my voice, my skills, and my story to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. That promise brought me here tonight." His voice softened as he shifted focus, addressing the individuals and families who had shared their own stories with him. "To those who have suffered, who have been judged unfairly, treated unjustly, or forgotten altogether, I see you, I hear you, and I stand with you. Your stories matter, your voices matter, and together, we are stronger than any system that seeks to divide us." The room was alive with emotion. Tears streamed down the faces of many in the audience, their expressions a mix of sorrow and hope. Emmanuel's words resonated deeply, not just because of his eloquence, but because of his authenticity. He continued, turning his attention to the systemic issues at the heart of the movement. "We are here tonight because we believe in the power of change. But change does not come from words alone. It comes from action, from courage, and from the willingness to challenge what is comfortable for what is right. It is not enough to demand justice, we must create it." As he outlined the reforms he and his allies were advocating for, his passion was unmistakable. He spoke of the need for independent oversight, increased transparency, and programs to rebuild trust between communities and law enforcement. But he also emphasized the importance of empathy, education, and understanding. "Change begins with us," he said. "It begins with how we treat one another, how we listen, and how we learn." Emmanuel's speech reached its emotional peak as he delivered a powerful call to action. "Tonight, I ask you to do more than stand with me. I ask you to stand for what is right, to challenge injustice wherever you see it, to use your voice for those who cannot, and to believe in the power of compassion and courage. Together, we can create a world where dignity is not conditional, where equality is not negotiable, and where justice is truly for all." The crowd rose to its feet, the sound of applause reverberating through the hall like a thunderclap. People cheered, clapped, and wept, their collective energy a testament to the impact of Emmanuel's words. The broadcast of the speech went viral within hours, shared millions of times across social media. Clips of Emmanuel's most poignant moments were replayed on news programs, sparking renewed conversations about justice and reform. His words became a rallying cry for the movement, inspiring actions large and small, from peaceful protests and policy advocacy to heartfelt conversations and personal introspection. For Emmanuel, the speech was not an endpoint, but a milestone. He knew that the journey ahead would be long and arduous, filled with setbacks and challenges. But as he stood on that stage, bathed in the glow of the audience's response, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was what the fight for justice looked like: messy, emotional, and profoundly human. Emmanuel's speech marked a turning point for the movement, galvanizing support and pushing the fight for justice to new heights. But as the movement grew, so did the resistance from those who opposed change. How would Emmanuel and his allies navigate the inevitable pushback? And what steps would they take to ensure that their vision of equality and accountability became a lasting reality? The answers lay ahead as the fight for justice entered its most critical phase. Stay tuned. The dust of the marshes had begun to settle, the echoes of Emmanuel's powerful speech still lingering in the minds of millions. Yet, the journey for justice was far from over. What had started as a single man's humiliation had transformed into a movement, call for change that touched the lives of countless individuals. Now it was time to reflect on what had been accomplished, what remained undone, and what lessons the world could carry forward. For Emmanuel Pedram, reflection came naturally. Late at night, after the whirlwind of meetings, speeches, and interviews, he would sit by the window of his modest home, gazing at the city lights. Each flicker reminded him of the people he had met along the way: the young protester who held a sign saying, "I march for my future," the grandmother who shared her story of losing her son to police violence, and the countless voices that had cried out for justice. These moments became the foundation of his resolve, affirming that the fight for equality was not a fleeting endeavor, but a lifelong commitment. Emmanuel's story was no longer his alone. It had become a lens through which society examined itself, a mirror, reflecting the flaws of a system that had long gone unchallenged. His wrongful arrest had been a painful reminder of the prejudice embedded in institutions meant to protect. But it had also been a spark that ignited a broader conversation about accountability, empathy, and humanity. In the months following his landmark speech, tangible progress began to emerge. Several cities implemented reforms inspired by Emmanuel's proposals, adopting measures for independent oversight and increased transparency in policing. Training programs focused on cultural competence and de-escalation techniques were introduced, signaling a shift toward more compassionate approaches to law enforcement. While these changes were steps in the right direction, Emmanuel understood they were only the beginning. For every victory, there were reminders of how much work remained. Resistance to reform persisted in some quarters, with detractors arguing that the changes were too radical or impractical. Media pundits debated the movement's goals, some dismissing it as idealistic, while others applauded its pragmatism. Through it all, Emmanuel remained steadfast, his voice a steady compass pointing toward a future defined by fairness and dignity. One of the most profound aspects of Emmanuel's reflection was the realization that change wasn't only about systems, it was about people. Policies could be rewritten and practices could be reformed, but true progress depended on shifting hearts and minds. Emmanuel often spoke about the importance of empathy, urging individuals to see each other's humanity before anything else. When we strip away the labels race, status, profession, we are left with what truly matters: our shared humanity, he said in a heartfelt interview. Emmanuel's words resonated beyond the confines of his own community. Educators began incorporating his story into their curricula, using it as a case study to teach students about social justice and civic engagement. Artists created murals and performances inspired by the movement, turning his message into a cultural force. Faith leaders invoked Emmanuel's resilience in sermons, encouraging their congregations to stand for what was right, even when it was difficult. In one particularly moving moment, a young woman approached Emmanuel at a community event. She told him how his story had inspired her to pursue a career in law, driven by a desire to protect the vulnerable and challenge injustice. "You showed me that one voice can make a difference," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. Emmanuel, ever humble, smiled and responded, "It's not my voice alone, it's all of ours." Together, as the movement continued to grow, Emmanuel took time to acknowledge the sacrifices and contributions of others. He honored the activists who had marched tirelessly, the families who had shared their pain to illuminate systemic failures, and the allies who had stepped forward to lend their support. "This movement is not about one person or one moment," he often said. "It's about the collective courage to demand better for ourselves, for our children, and for future generations." The story of Emmanuel Pedram became more than a chapter in the fight for justice. It became a call to action. It urged individuals to question their own biases, to stand against injustice in their daily lives, and to engage with their communities in meaningful ways. Emmanuel's journey reminded the world that progress was possible, but it required vigilance, collaboration, and an unyielding belief in the power of change. As he reflected on the road ahead, Emmanuel remained optimistic. "The fight for justice is not a straight path," he once said. "It's a winding road, full of setbacks and challenges. But every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to the world we dream of." For those who followed Emmanuel's story, the message was clear. His experience was a stark reminder that injustice could happen to anyone, but it was also a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the transformative power of unity. It called on each individual to ask themselves, "What am I doing to make a difference? How am I contributing to a world where justice and equality prevail?" Emmanuel's story may have been one man's experience, but its lessons belong to everyone. It challenged people to confront their own roles in shaping a fairer society and left an indelible mark on the collective conscience. But as history has shown, the fight for justice is never truly over. What lies ahead for Emmanuel and the movement he helped inspire? Will the seeds of change planted in this moment grow into a lasting legacy? Stay tuned as the journey continues to unfold. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit the subscribe button and join us in spreading messages of justice, compassion, and unity. Share this video with your friends and family to keep the conversation alive. And leave a comment below. What does justice mean to you? Together, we can create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued.